So in the first section, I want to explain how big are cells, right? So if we look at this diagram, it shows a spectrum of different molecules where we can see generally the size of different things. Around the center of the image, you can see a cluster of red blood cells. Red blood cells are approximately 7 to 8 micrometers in diameter. Now, if you look over at the human hair, which is about 1 millimeter, there are 1,000 micrometers in 1 millimeter. A human cell is approximately anywhere from 10 to 100 micrometers. And the smallest thing that we can see with the human eye, if our eyes are really good, is 100 micrometers. So when we're looking at things like bacteria, now we're getting down into like almost the 1 to 3 to 5 micrometer range. So that would be 1,000 to 5,000 nanometers. Okay, we can see that with a bright field microscope or a light microscope. And you can see on my diagram, I've added 60x, 20x, and 10x. These are the objectives that I can set the microscope to. And so anything smaller, like we can't see viruses, we can't see antibodies, we can't see spike proteins, and we certainly can't see things like DNA or water molecules in a light microscope. So most of the time, I actually use the 60 times objective. Now this is showing, this scale bar is 30 micrometers, and right above that you can see one nice healthy red blood cell that is approximately 7 to 8 micrometers. And now you can see in the plasma more clearly. And I have a video here showing normal blood. And this is really cool because it gives you a sense of how much the blood is moving. And right here, I'll pause the video for a second to show you up in the top right-hand corner, we have an immune cell that's crawling around. And so that's a neutrophil, and it is moving around looking for pathogens and things that it can engulf. And as we scroll around, you can see some more immune cells. Generally, the plasma is really clear. Here in this section, we can see a basophil. And these are usually only active when people have allergic reactions. So here is a nice example of what you would typically see in a generally healthy person. There's no blood clots. There's no, weird looking red blood cells. There's the normal amount of immune cells. And this diagram is showing what a normal blood sample would look like with dark field. And all of the circles are the red blood cells. And then over here on the left side is a nice looking neutrophil. And neutrophils are the immune cell that are generally the first responders. When we're looking at live blood, we want these neutrophils to be generally active. We want them to be kind of moving around. Here is a blood sample that shows some unhealthy characteristics. In this image, we can see that the red blood cells are not round. Now they're taking on all these weird shapes. They can look like balloon shapes. They can have the spiky appearance. These spikes, by the way, are not spike protein. These are just effects on the red blood cell membrane that show that the red blood cell is oxidized or damaged, and it could potentially be dying. Most red blood cells that become damaged will die shortly after that. In A here, we can see this indentation. We call that a cloud cell, and this is an indication that there's fibrin, which comes from platelets that will form clots. But sometimes the fibers are so fine that we can't see them, but they're still there, and we can see that effect on the red blood cells. E is pointing to a platelet aggregation. Platelets are the fragments in our blood that can form blood clots. And then down at the bottom, we have a nice looking white blood cell. So in this sample, this is not a perfectly healthy person because the red blood cells are not round. They have all kinds of odd shapes, and we have microclotting. So this is showing a level of inflammation happening in this person. In this microscope image, we can see a generally healthy person, but just a little bit of weirdness in the red blood cells. In this example, because the plasma is so clear, most of the red blood cells look okay, but the bumpy nature of the red blood cells, this could simply mean that this person was a little dehydrated or they just had a stress response. So there's various things that we can see, but we always have to put it together with what is the picture happening with the client. So if somebody has various kinds of symptoms, if they've had food sensitivities, if they've had exposure to electromagnetic fields, if they've recently been working out, if they, have had a lot of stress, there's multiple factors that can contribute to what the blood looks like. So when we look at the blood, we can see very healthy blood, we can see moderately healthy blood, and then we can see wow, there's a lot of things going on here with damaged red blood cells and microclots and lots of immune cells, so we can see generally if there's a lot of inflammation or oxidative stress, but I wouldn't be able to say this is because specifically that you had EMF exposure. But when we look at the whole picture of the client, we can usually figure out what is causing the oxidative stress, and then people can see, something is going on and something has to change before, symptoms start to get worse. So those are some general things that we can see when we look at live blood. Section 2, I want to look at what are the effects of electromagnetic fields on our cells and our body. So when we look at electromagnetic fields, these can come from everything from electricity off of the grid, solar electricity, anything that has a motor will make electricity and magnetic energy, windmills, power lines, up to our internet, Wi-Fi signals, Bluetooth signals, our cell phone signals, and 4G and 5G signals. So all of those things make up electromagnetic fields that can affect us in various ways. When we look at this diagram, this is generally what an electromagnetic spectrum involves. In the center, I've shown at the top with a big red circle, this is our Wi-Fi signal. This is 2.4 gigahertz, which is a frequency of energy. And we measure the frequencies in hertz, kilohertz, megahertz, or gigahertz, or even much higher than that. And then we can also measure the wavelength, the size of the wavelength. So from peak to peak in a wavelength, you can see at the bottom of this diagram where we have the blue section that says radio wave spectrum, and you can see that white wave in the middle. So as we move from the left side towards the right side, the frequencies are increasing and the wavelengths are decreasing. So over here on the gamma rays side, the frequency is really high and the nanometer wavelengths, or the wavelengths are in the nanometer range. They're very small, so they have high intensity. So at the bottom, also notice where the visible light spectrum is. So anything to the right of the visible light spectrum, ultraviolet light, our UV light, some of it we need to make vitamin D, X-rays and gamma rays, generally this is called ionizing radiation. Those frequencies are so high that they can directly damage our cells and cause ionization. Electrons can be pulled off of our molecules and it's very damaging. Everything on the left side of the visible light spectrum, infrared, microwaves, radio waves, and then the low frequency waves, these are all part of the radio wave spectrum, but it can actually generally be broken into radio waves and microwaves. All of these, even though they're considered non-ionizing, they can still affect our cells. Maybe not as rapidly as something like an X-ray, but over time, exposure to those frequencies has a major impact on our cells, also causing free radical formation or ionizing of the molecules, but in an indirect way. And I'll show you how that works. So back to our Wi-Fi signals. Wi-Fi signals are about 2.4 gigahertz in frequency. Same with our microwave ovens, actually, are 2.45 gigahertz. So it's almost exactly the same in energy frequency, right? So considering that our microwave ovens have to be basically in a Faraday cage, but Wi-Fi signals can just be all over the place in our house and school and work. It's actually a little bit crazy. And then when we look at 5G, so 4G is the 2.4 gigahertz frequency. That's what most Wi-Fi signals are. But now some internet also includes 5G signals. The 5G signals can be anywhere from 3 to 5 gigahertz all the way up to, generally the 24 gigahertz range, but it can even potentially go higher than that. So when we're looking at 5G, it's not 5 gigahertz. There's a whole spectrum of frequencies that can be 5G signals. 5G just means fifth generation. And who knows what they're going to do with 6G? Probably in this 86 gigahertz range will be the 6G stuff. So when we're looking at Bluetooth and satellites and our cell phones, we're in this gigahertz range of frequencies. But lower than that, when we're looking at radios and electricity, those frequencies, even though they're lower frequencies, they can still impact our cells. Again, lower frequencies might just take a little bit longer to affect us. But when we're living in homes that have smart meters and smart refrigerators and Wi-Fi signals, plus we have induction cooktops and we have, washers and dryers and ovens and microwaves and, dimmer switches and fans with multiple speeds, like all of those things can create what we call dirty electricity. Different things make more dirty electricity than others, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So when we're looking at this spectrum of frequencies, I want to talk about how can we know that that's even happening. In this slide, I've listed the most common EMF hypersensitivity symptoms. Not everybody is hypersensitive to EMF. Some people very distinctly notice when they're around electromagnetic fields. And other people may have these symptoms, but they just don't associate it with being exposed to electromagnetic fields. And, looking at this list, maybe you have had some of these symptoms. And again, having any of these symptoms doesn't necessarily mean that it's because of electromagnetic fields, right? There's lots of reasons for lots of symptoms, but these are the most common ones. And if you have a whole bunch of these, it's a good indication that perhaps electromagnetic fields are part of, the cause of these symptoms. So tinnitus, hot flashes, thermal reactions, the postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, when you stand up and get dizzy and then your heart rate speeds up. Itching. Itching skin is an indication of potential histamine reactions, or mast cell activation syndrome, where you have a large amount of histamine. Inflammation, if you start to get mucusy and, sneezing and coughing. And, sometimes when people have had colds that last for many, many months, it is entirely possible that there's an EMF, component to that. There's lots of inflammatory immune effects that can happen from electromagnetic fields. Skin conditions, fatigue, brain fog, cancer, clotting, bleeding. So some people will have bleeding effects. Some people will have excessive clotting effects. It can affect your sleep. It can affect your gastrointestinal tract. One of the main things that I've seen hugely in the last little while with clients is an effect on the leaky gut, on the intestines. Electromagnetic fields are very terrible for our gut lining. And when the gut lining, the intestinal epithelial cells, can't remain intact, then you're more likely to have food sensitivities. So then when you eat things and you start to have reactions, right, that's because the gut lining is damaged. The gut lining can be damaged from lots of toxins, but it includes EMF. And I now actually personally categorize EMFs as a toxin. So when we look at, plastic and forever chemicals and heavy metals and pesticides, EMF is in my list of toxins now because it has as much, if not more, impact than many other toxic things that we're used to thinking about as a toxin. It can affect your gut microbiome. It can damage your DNA. And again, it depends on the amount of exposure and the duration, how close you are to certain things that are emitting either radio frequencies or dirty electricity. And I have lots of suggestions for how we can deal with that. So how at the cellular level are these electromagnetic fields affecting us? Two of the most main things that happen with electromagnetic fields. Okay, think about how our body, we are electric organisms. We're made of water and our cells conduct electricity. Our cells have a charge. The inside of a typical cell is about negative 60 millivolts. And we have sodium ions and potassium ions and calcium ions inside and outside of our cells that cause cells to have a charge. Now, the charge of the cell is very important for how the cell functions, how we move nutrients in or how we get rid of waste products, how the cell interacts with other cells. It's all based on charge. So when we have electromagnetic fields, it can affect the charge of the cells. One of the primary ways it does it is through voltage-gated calcium channels. In this diagram, I'm showing a typical voltage-gated channel inside of a membrane. So these little circles with waggly tails here, these are phospholipids making up a cell membrane. Every single cell in the body is made of phospholipids, and including our mitochondrial membranes. When these voltage-gated channels are closed, ions can't move across the membrane. So typically minus 60, minus 70 millivolts, okay, then the voltage-gated channel is going to be closed. When that voltage starts to change, that's going to trigger this to open, which will allow calcium to move across the membrane. Now, when calcium moves across a membrane, let's just look quickly at how it normally works. Normally, calcium channels are really important for the nervous system and for the muscles to make our muscles contract. We'll look at a nervous system cell here, a neuron. In the top right, you can see that we have what we call a presynaptic neuron. It just means this is the one that's going to release the neurotransmitters that will impact the next cell. And then the second cell is the postsynaptic neuron because the space in between them is a synapse. Now, this is a zoomed in section that shows, I've circled it in red, the calcium channel. These calcium channels open normally when we have action potentials in our neurons. Like if we think, I'm going to pick up my coffee cup, I need to contract these muscles, those signals move down neurons until it gets to the end of a neuron where the voltage change causes these calcium channels to open, and then calcium moves in. When calcium moves in to that synaptic bulb, that triggers the release of neurotransmitters. So if we're going to contract a muscle, the neurotransmitter will be something like acetylcholine. Okay? If the neurotransmitters released are impacting our mood, it might release dopamine or serotonin or glutamate. And so there's lots of different neurotransmitters that have different effects on our brain and our body and our muscles. But they're all essentially released because of calcium moving into the cell. So when we have electromagnetic frequencies that are hyperstimulating this effect, then you're going to overstimulate the nervous system and the muscles. So affecting voltage-gated calcium channels is one of the most important ways that electromagnetic fields affect our cells. The next way is when we actually use that calcium to create reactive oxygen species, or ROSs. When we have increased calcium, that can affect our nitric oxide pathway, and it can combine with superoxide, and it can create this molecule called peroxynitrite, which is the most radical of the free radicals in our body. So when we have a molecule that is a free radical, It basically has an unpaired electron. Electrons always want to go in pairs so that they're stable. When an electron is pulled off, then that last remaining electron really wants to have another electron paired with it. So when there's a single electron that's unpaired, it's a free radical. And you can see from my little cartoon here that free radicals will try to steal electrons from anything, from our cell membranes, from proteins, from our DNA. So when we have a lot of free radicals, this causes a lot of cellular damage. So how do we neutralize free radicals? We need antioxidants. So over here, the guy with the sunglasses, this antioxidant is going to donate electrons to the free radicals, so the free radicals don't steal it from our normal healthy cells and molecules. The next factor that's important about this is I want to mention nuclear factor erythroid 2, or NRF2. This is a key regulatory molecule that helps our body to produce its own antioxidants. We make antioxidants. You may have heard of glutathione. It's one of the body's most important antioxidant molecules. So think about, like, we know that vitamin C is an antioxidant. It will donate electrons. Every ascorbic acid or vitamin C molecule can donate one, and then basically it's used up. In our cells, when we make glutathione, we can recycle that, and we can get rid of millions of free radical molecules. So we want to be able to support our antioxidant system inside our body. So we can take vitamin C as a supplement or other antioxidants, and that will be beneficial, but not nearly as beneficial as supporting our body's own actual antioxidant pathways. And NRF2 is one of the main key regulators of how our body produces its own antioxidants. When you have long-term chronic exposure to, say, dirty electricity and Wi-Fi signals and cell phone signals, and you carry your cell phone in your pocket and you put your laptop on your lap, and you're just constantly exposed to this stuff, you're going to overwhelm that NRF2 system. And then you're not going to make your endogenous antioxidant molecules. And so this can cause major health effects, because if you have continual free radical exposure and oxidative stress, then you're going to damage your DNA and damage your cells. It's going to increase inflammation. It can stimulate cancer cell growth, and it can affect every cell in your whole body. And so there are actually also really cool things that can stimulate NRF2. And obviously, decreasing exposure to things, toxic things like EMFs, is going to be the number one way. But there's lots of things that we can consume that are going to help support our antioxidant pathways. And that includes sulforaphanes that you would find in broccoli sprouts, curcumin, which we have long talked about as being a great anti-inflammatory. This is found in turmeric. Resveratrol, found in red grapes and red wine, and our EGEC, which is found in green tea. Very, very excellent for supporting our body's natural antioxidant pathways. And then also moderate exercise. When we exercise, we produce some free radicals, but then it also really stimulates this antioxidant pathway, and we make lots of glutathione after we exercise to help combat the free radicals that we made during the exercise. When we look at red blood cells, so now back to looking at the live blood, I can look at blood samples and I can tell if the charge of the membrane has been affected. And when we look at calcium channels, so remember in the neuron example, I told you that normally calcium goes in, makes neurotransmitters come out, and then if that's overstimulated, then we can have too much, stress molecules or, whatever neurotransmitter. In the red blood cells, the voltage, there's no voltage gated channels, but there's mechanically regulated calcium channels. They can be affected. Excess calcium can go into the red blood cells, and that has the effect of changing the charge of the cell by affecting the balance of ions and proteins. Proteins can have a charge as well, that are on or on the outside of the red blood cell membrane. So when we call this the zeta potential. So the red blood cell is normally supposed to be negative on the outside. So all the red blood cells should repel each other. The red blood cells should not be clumping together. When they do clump together, that shows there is a charge change in the red blood cells. This charge change can be because of EMFs, but it can also be because of lots of other kinds of toxins. So when I'm looking at the blood, if I didn't know the client's symptoms or circumstances and just looking at the blood, I wouldn't necessarily be able to say this is for sure an EMF pattern of looking at the blood, but I would be able to see oxidative stress, inflammation, and change in the charge of the red blood cells. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to mention is electromagnetic fields can also affect clotting. So microclots are when we have aggregated platelets that start to produce the fibrin, right? So the liver makes fibrinogen, which is always in the blood. And then when there's damage to the blood vessels or to the blood itself, or if there's inflammatory cytokines or if there's oxidative stress like free radicals, that will trigger the clotting cascade. And then we can see these fibers forming in the blood. In a healthy blood sample, that doesn't happen. The plasma is clear, you don't see platelets, and you don't see fibers. So this second image here is showing this clustering together of the red blood cells. They're not stacking together like coins, but they are coming together in this kind of honeycomb pattern. I see this all the time. As soon as a client walks into my office area and they have their cell phone in their pocket and earbuds in their ears, I know I'm going to see this, and inevitably every single time I will see this honeycomb pattern when people are carrying their phone on their body with Bluetooth on and Wi-Fi on all the time. When those are on, the phone is constantly communicating with towers and sending signals. And if it's touching your body, those signals are going into your body and affecting your cells. And here is an example of the honeycomb pattern from EMF exposure using the dark field condenser. In the middle here, we have an eosinophil. You can tell because it has granules and there's two lobes of the nucleus. And then so this client here in the dark field image, this was a client that was generally healthy and was just driving a new vehicle that's full of radio frequency, everything from, tracking devices and GPS and Bluetooth, cell phone on, listening to an audiobook with Bluetooth, mega exposure to EMF. And this is what his blood looked like when he first came. And so then we went outside. This was in the summer. We went outside barefoot, walked around the property, and did some grounding. Grounding is one of the most amazing things we can do because we can get electrons from the earth. So there is a giant pool of electrons in the earth, and it can go through our skin when we're digging in the dirt with our hands in the garden, walking on the grass, walking on the beach, on sand, So we can get electrons from the earth. And this was an hour later. This is showing that after about an hour of grounding, that honeycomb pattern was starting to break up. And now, depending on the amount of exposure, right, if you have minimal exposure and then you're periodically on your computer or a Zoom call or you're holding your phone for an hour, and this happens with your cells, generally, if you can go outside for an hour or two, it will very significantly decrease that EMF exposure effect. But if you never ground and you're depleted in antioxidants and you're surrounded by smart devices, anything smart, wireless, and cordless, there's a lot of EMF. And so if you're surrounded by it all the time and you fall asleep with your phone on your pillow, then it's going to take significantly longer to be able to mitigate the effects of the EMF on your cells. Here is an image. So in June, I was messing around and experimenting on myself and then looking at my blood. And this one day, I went out to the big hydro power lines, and I was out there for about half an hour, and I was measuring things with my tri-field, which I'll show you. And I spent, quite a bit of time out there. And then I came home and I looked at my blood, and you can see in this diagram that the red blood cells just, they're not even sticking together anymore. They're just dying. So when the red blood cells are this damaged, that means that they're in a cell death pattern. And this is huge amounts of oxidative stress. Luckily, we can replace our red blood cells fairly quickly, but still, this is an indication of how much damage can occur from high exposures to EMF. So I want to reiterate that lots of toxins can cause this kind of effect in our cells. I know the EMF pattern because I experimented with myself. I had the situation where I had a solar system inverter that was very dirty, and it was affecting me like so badly, and I was so sick. Inflammation and mast cell activation and, orthostatic hypotension and tinnitus and allergies, and it was crazy. I was so sick for so long, and I finally figured out that it was my solar system inverter. And so I saw a lot of what happened with my blood, how long it took to recover. And then I would start, exposing myself to little bits of things and just to see what would happen. Crazy. But, now I can definitely tell when somebody has EMF exposure pattern, but it could also be other toxins. So here's a list of the most common toxins that can affect our blood, but also, inflammatory foods. We want to make sure that we're not eating trans fats and refined processed seed oils and tons of sugar and packaged food. We want to eat plants and animals, preferably not sprayed with pesticides and herbicides. So now let's look specifically at just a quick list of how EMFs can specifically affect the immune system. So number one, we talked about oxidative stress. So when we have free radicals, unpaired electrons, they can affect other molecules trying to steal electrons, trying to be balanced. So that's oxidative stress. So that can affect our antioxidant system that I talked about. The NRF2 can be affected, so then we can't make our own glutathione and other antioxidants. So when we have a lot of EMF exposure, we're going to lose our ability to be able to make our own antioxidants. Voltage-gated calcium channels. So the immune system also has voltage-gated calcium channels that affects how they function. When we have too much calcium going into the cells, that's going to affect our stress response, and it's going to affect inflammation. So inflammatory response. When we have exposure to electromagnetic fields, it can increase the expression of inflammatory cytokines, and this can just continue to contribute to the whole inflammatory pathway. This can actually also affect autoimmune diseases, so it can increase autoimmune symptoms, and it can trigger flare-ups in people that have autoimmune conditions. EMFs can also directly affect white blood cells specifically, and, it can damage and kill immune cells. For example, if we damage our natural killer cells, then we're going to lose our ability to get rid of cancer cells. So there can be indirect effects when we affect the immune system. It can lead to other situations. It can make us immunosuppressed, so we're not as able to fight off colds and flus and infections that are going around. It can also amplify the inflammatory stuff and increase autoimmune conditions and chronic inflammatory conditions. So also, if we have a suppressed immune system, this can trigger the release of latent viruses like herpes, cold sores, and Lyme disease, and what's the other one that's really common? Epstein-Barr, shingles. But when our immune system is suppressed, then those kinds of latent viruses can become activated again. It can affect our blood-brain barrier. So that means inflammatory molecules can get from the blood into our brain. So just like the digestive system, our intestines have a barrier. The brain also has a barrier. It's very similar. If your gut is damaged and you have food sensitivities, you probably also have some blood-brain barrier inflammation going on as well. So then that can affect cognitive function, brain fog, fatigue, those kinds of things. EMFs can directly damage DNA. When we have oxidative stress and a lot of free radicals, those free radicals can steal electrons from our DNA. And if we do that, we can trigger DNA mutations that can then lead to cancers and all kinds of other problems. EMFs can activate our stress response. So when we're impacting our immune system, if we have hypersecretion of cortisol from the adrenal glands from a stress response, cortisol is going to inhibit the immune response. When we inhibit our immune system, then we're more susceptible to all kinds of infections. Also, EMFs can affect our melatonin production. Melatonin is produced in the brain when it's getting dark, and it's made by the pineal gland to help us sleep. Melatonin also has a really important effect on our immune system to help decrease inflammation. So if we can't make melatonin naturally, that is going to have an indirect effect on our immune function. So I also want to mention mitochondria. These are the organelles inside all of our cells in our whole entire body that produce energy. Every cell has at least 1,000, maybe even up to 3,000 mitochondria, and they help us produce ATP, and they also help us regulate our cell cycle, and they can induce apoptosis and autophagy when we're detoxifying. Many, many, many functions of mitochondria. If electromagnetic fields are damaging the mitochondria, then it's going to affect our energy production, which can affect all of the cells in our whole body. Here is a typical, stereotypical image of a cell, and the red arrow is pointing to the mitochondria. And when these mitochondria are not functioning properly, we call that mitochondrial dysfunction. There are lots of symptoms that are associated with mitochondrial dysfunction, particularly metabolic disorders and neurological disorders, but we can also feel things like fatigue and muscle weakness, blood sugar dysregulation. It'll affect the immune system, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal. So just like how EMFs affect the immune system, which can indirectly affect all other body systems, when EMFs affect our mitochondria, it literally affects every system in our whole body.